In episode 74, titled SSID Strategy, Hidden versus Advertised and What It Affects, the focus is on SSID design as a blend of user experience and security posture, rather than as a cosmetic naming decision. Wireless network names shape how users discover and join networks, how devices roam across access points, and how segmentation is communicated across an environment. The exam tests SSID strategy because it is a common place where organizations unintentionally create weak isolation, inconsistent authentication, and unnecessary airtime overhead by proliferating networks. Hidden versus advertised SSIDs is part of that discussion, but it is often misunderstood, and the exam uses it as a trap to see whether you confuse visibility with security. The real security value comes from meaningful segmentation and strong authentication, not from obscuring the network name. SSIDs also create operational commitments, because once you deploy an SSID broadly, changing it affects devices, onboarding, and support processes. When you keep SSID strategy simple and intentional, wireless becomes easier to secure and easier to operate. This episode builds the reasoning to choose SSIDs based on purpose, authentication mode, and isolation requirements. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Advertised SSIDs ease discovery and support standard roaming behavior because clients can see them in beacon frames and make normal association decisions across the coverage area. Advertisement is the default behavior where access points broadcast the SSID, allowing users and devices to discover the network without prior configuration. This improves user experience because it reduces support burden and makes network selection straightforward, especially for guest access and general corporate networks. Advertisement also supports predictable roaming because clients can observe consistent SSID presence across access points and maintain connections as they move. In enterprise environments, consistent advertised SSIDs across sites make user behavior predictable, reducing confusion and reducing the chance that clients connect to the wrong network due to inconsistent naming. The exam expects you to recognize advertised SSIDs as normal and generally preferred for usability, especially when proper authentication and segmentation exist. Advertised does not mean insecure, because security depends on authentication and encryption rather than on whether the name is visible. For many environments, hiding the SSID creates more operational cost than security benefit. When you treat advertisement as a user experience and roaming enabler, you can choose it confidently when security controls are implemented correctly. Hidden SSIDs reduce casual visibility but do not stop attackers, because hiding the name does not remove the network's presence on the air and does not prevent it from being discovered through normal wireless traffic analysis. A hidden SSID means the access point does not include the SSID name in certain broadcast messages, which can prevent casual users from seeing it in a simple network list. However, clients that connect to a hidden SSID still send probes and association requests that can reveal the SSID name, and an attacker with basic monitoring tools can observe that traffic. The exam often tests this because people mistake not listed for secure, and that is a false assumption in wireless environments. Hidden SSIDs can also create usability issues because clients may behave differently, such as sending directed probes, which can increase airtime usage and can leak the SSID name into other environments. Hidden networks can also cause roaming quirks because clients may take longer to find and connect, especially in dense environments with many networks. This means hiding can actually degrade performance and user experience without delivering meaningful security improvement. When you understand hidden SSIDs as obscurity rather than protection, you avoid relying on them as a control. Meaningful segmentation is the real goal of SSI design, and it usually involves distinct networks for guests, corporate users, and device networks rather than a long list of special-purpose names. A guest network should provide internet access with strong isolation from internal resources and from other guests when appropriate. A corporate network should provide authenticated access to internal services with policies aligned to user identity and device posture where possible. A device network, often used for Internet of Things endpoints, should provide limited access appropriate to the device function, because those devices often have weaker security properties and should not be placed on the same network as user laptops. The exam expects you to treat SSIDs as segmentation boundaries that map to VLANs, policies, and access controls, not simply as convenience labels. Segmentation also improves troubleshooting, because when a device is on a given SSID, you can infer what policies apply and what resources should be reachable. A small number of well-defined SSIDs is usually safer than many overlapping networks, because fewer networks means fewer chances to misconfigure isolation. When SSIDs reflect purpose, policy becomes easier to enforce and audit. This is the design mindset the exam is looking for. Authentication differences are central because open, captive, and enterprise modes imply different threat models and operational behaviors. Open access means no authentication at the wireless layer, which may be acceptable for guest access only when paired with appropriate isolation and monitoring, but it is not suitable for internal networks. Captive portal access introduces a web-based login or acceptance step, often used in guest networks, but it does not necessarily provide strong encryption unless additional controls are used. Enterprise authentication, often based on identity credentials and strong encryption, is the typical choice for corporate SSIDs because it ties access to user or device identity and supports stronger access control. The exam uses these modes as scenario hints because they affect both user experience and security assurance, especially in environments with compliance requirements. A guest SSID might use Captive Portal to provide usability and policy acceptance, while a corporate SSID uses enterprise authentication to ensure only authorized users connect. Device networks may use pre-shared credentials or device certificates depending on capability, but they still require segmentation because the devices are often not trustworthy. When you connect authentication mode to the SSID's purpose, your architecture becomes consistent. The key is that SSID naming and authentication must align with the intended trust model. SSID count impacts performance because too many SSIDs increase management overhead and airtime waste through repeated beacons and management traffic. Every SSID adds broadcast and management frames that consume airtime, and airtime is the shared resource that determines wireless capacity. In dense environments, management overhead can become significant, reducing the time available for actual user data traffic. Too many SSIDs also complicate roaming and client behavior because devices must scan and evaluate more networks, which can slow association and increase battery usage. The exam tests this because it emphasizes that wireless is not free capacity and management traffic competes with user traffic. A smaller set of SSIDs reduces overhead, reduces misconfiguration surface, and improves clarity for users and support teams. Many organizations accumulate SSIDs over time for temporary purposes and never remove them, creating long-term performance and security debt. SSID minimization is therefore both a performance optimization and a governance practice. When you keep SSIDs few and purposeful, you improve reliability and reduce airtime waste. A scenario where a guest SSID must isolate clients from internal resources illustrates the core security requirement that guest access should not become an internal foothold. Guest clients should not be able to reach internal servers, management networks, or corporate endpoints because guest devices are uncontrolled and can be compromised. Isolation typically includes network segmentation, firewall policy that restricts access, and often client isolation within the guest network so that one guest cannot attack another guest. The SSID itself is only the label and access point entry, while the real isolation is enforced by VLAN separation, routing boundaries, and security policies upstream. The exam expects you to recognize that a guest SSID is a segmentation boundary and that isolation must be explicit, not assumed. It also expects you to consider that captive portals and open authentication are not isolation mechanisms because they govern access to the network but do not prevent internal reachability unless policy enforces it. Proper isolation also improves compliance by ensuring that external users cannot access internal systems inadvertently. When you can describe guest isolation as a policy boundary behind the SSID, you demonstrate correct security reasoning. Relying on hidden SSID as a security control is a common pitfall because it confuses reduced visibility with actual protection. Attackers can discover hidden SSIDs through passive monitoring, and hiding does not prevent brute force attempts, credential attacks, or exploitation of client devices. Hidden SSIDs can also increase management traffic because clients may probe actively for the network, which can slightly increase airtime usage and leak information about your network name into other locations. The exam tests this pitfall explicitly because it is a classic misconception, and correct answers emphasize strong authentication and segmentation rather than hiding. Security controls should be measurable and enforceable, such as identity-based authentication and firewall rules, not based on whether a casual user can see the SSID in a list. Hidden SSIDs may have a limited role in reducing casual clutter, but they should never be presented as a meaningful barrier. When you treat hiding as a minor usability choice rather than security, you avoid designing on false premises. The correct posture is to assume attackers can see the network and still protect it. Reusing the same SSID with different security settings is another pitfall because it creates client confusion and can lead to inconsistent behavior and unintended downgrades. If one site uses an SSID name with enterprise authentication, while another site uses the same name with a different method, clients may attempt to connect and fail or may connect under weaker settings than intended. This can create support issues and can also create security risk if devices connect in unexpected ways. Even within the same site, inconsistent security settings across access points for the same SSID can break roaming and cause repeated re-authentication events that look like instability. The exam tests this because it emphasizes consistency across sites, especially in multi-site deployments where users travel. SSID name should be a promise about how the network behaves, including what authentication and policy applies. When you reuse a name, you must preserve that promise, or you should use a different name to avoid confusion and misassociation. Consistent SSID definition across access points and sites is a core operational requirement for reliable wireless. Quick wins include keeping SSIDs few, documenting their purpose, and enforcing isolation, because these actions reduce both performance overhead and security risk quickly. Keeping SSIDs few reduces airtime waste and reduces the number of configurations that can drift or conflict. Documenting purpose ensures that every SSID has a clear reason to exist, a defined authentication mode, and a defined segmentation policy, which supports auditing and prevents temporary SSIDs from becoming permanent clutter. Enforcing isolation ensures that SSIDs that represent different trust levels, such as guest and corporate, truly cannot reach each other's resources unless explicitly allowed. These quick wins also make troubleshooting easier because the SSID becomes a reliable indicator of policy, and policy becomes consistent across the environment. The exam often rewards answers that show governance and simplicity because complex SSID sprawl is a common enterprise mistake. Reducing SSIDs is also an opportunity to improve user experience by making choices clearer and reducing confusion. When you implement these quick wins, wireless becomes more predictable. Standardizing naming across sites is an operational cue because consistency reduces support burden and improves roaming and onboarding experiences for users and devices. A corporate SSID should be named the same across sites and should behave the same, using the same authentication method and the same policy model, so that user devices connect seamlessly when traveling. Guest SSIDs should also be consistent, with consistent portal behavior and isolation, so that visitors have a predictable experience. Device SSIDs should be clearly named to reflect purpose and should not be easily mistaken for user networks, because devices may have different onboarding processes and policy constraints. The exam expects you to recognize naming as part of operational consistency, not just aesthetics. Naming conventions also reduce the chance of users connecting to the wrong network, which can create security issues if the wrong network has weaker controls. Standardization supports documentation and change control because you can describe networks in a consistent way. When names are consistent and purposeful, wireless administration becomes more manageable. A useful memory anchor is few SSIDs, clear purpose, strong auth, isolate, because it captures the priorities that keep SSID strategy sane and secure. Few SSIDs reminds you that each SSID consumes airtime and adds configuration surface, so minimizing count improves performance and reduces drift. Clear purpose reminds you that each SSID should map to a specific trust level and use case, such as corporate, guest, or devices, not vague or overlapping categories. Strong auth reminds you that security comes from authentication and encryption appropriate to the trust level, not from hiding names. Isolate reminds you that segmentation must be enforced so that guest and device networks cannot reach internal resources unless explicitly intended. This anchor helps you answer exam questions because it tells you what to optimize for: simplicity, clarity, authentication strength, and enforced boundaries. It also helps you avoid the trap of treating hidden SSIDs as a major security feature. When you apply this anchor, you design networks that are both usable and defensible. To apply the strategy, imagine choosing an SSID set for an office with guests and Internet of Things devices, and start by limiting the set to the minimum that supports the distinct trust zones. You would typically have a corporate SSID using enterprise authentication for employees, A guest SSID with appropriate access method and strong isolation from internal resources, and a device SSID for Internet of Things endpoints with restricted access appropriate to device function. The corporate SSID should provide the best user experience with consistent roaming and strong security, while the guest SSID should prioritize safe Internet access without internal reachability. The device SSID should be designed under the assumption that devices are less trustworthy, so segmentation and limited access are essential. You would avoid adding additional SSIDs unless there is a clear, documented purpose that cannot be met through policy within an existing SSID. You would also ensure that naming and security settings are consistent across sites, so devices and users behave predictably. The exam expects this kind of minimal, purpose-driven set because it demonstrates clear segmentation thinking and avoids overhead. When you can justify why each SSID exists and what policy it enforces, you show the correct design pattern. To close episode 74, titled SSID Strategy, Hidden versus Advertised and What It Affects, the key is that SSID design shapes discovery, roaming behavior, and segmentation, and the safest approach is to keep networks few, purposeful, and consistently secured. Advertised SSIDs support normal discovery and roaming and are not inherently insecure when strong authentication and isolation exist. Hidden SSIDs reduce casual visibility but do not stop attackers and can introduce operational and performance quirks, which is why they are not a meaningful security control. Meaningful segmentation into guest, corporate, and device networks is the real security posture driver, and authentication modes such as open, captive, and enterprise must align with the trust model. Too many SSIDs waste airtime and increase configuration surface, while inconsistent security settings under the same SSID name create client confusion and potential downgrades. Quick wins come from minimizing SSIDs, documenting purpose, enforcing isolation, and standardizing naming across sites for consistent behavior. The memory anchor of few SSIDs with clear purpose, strong authentication, and isolation provides a reliable decision filter. Your rehearsal assignment is an SSID inventory exercise where you list each SSID in a site, state its purpose and authentication mode, and describe what it is isolated from, because that exercise is how you prove SSID strategy understanding in the way the exam expects. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.